My mom tried to drown me at my own baby shower. You won't believe what happened next, and standing in front of the mirror in our quiet little townhouse tucked into an older part of Providence, Rhode Island, I took a moment to smooth out the creases in the soft fabric of my pale green maternity dress. At 7 months pregnant, even breathing sometimes felt like hauling groceries up 4 flights of stairs, but there was something about this stage, feeling the baby roll inside me, that made me forget the aches for a few seconds. My hand, almost on instinct, rested against the taut curve of my belly, and a quiet smile pulled at my lips when I felt the faintest kick ripple beneath the surface. Just then, Mason poked his head around the corner of his office doorway, holding out my cell phone with that familiar serious look that usually meant trouble. "It's your mom," he said, quietly, already sensing the tension that would fill the room the moment I answered. I froze for a second, jaw tightening slightly, then forced myself to take a deep breath and reach for the phone like it weighed 100 pounds. "Hi, Mom," I said, bracing for impact. "Nora, I've been meaning to call you about the baby shower," my mother began, her voice already carrying that condescending tone she always used when she was about to bulldoze me. "Tessa and I talked it over, and we've moved the venue. That little cafe you picked is far too casual. It doesn't have the elegance a proper shower should have. The Redwood Club is more appropriate, and I've already made the reservation." I blinked. She wasn't asking. She was announcing. I swallowed down the flare of anxiety and kept my voice calm, though my grip on the phone was tight enough to make my fingers hurt. "I already signed a contract with Willowbend Cafe. My friends know the location, the decorations are set. It's all arranged, Mom." She didn't miss a beat before steamrolling me again. "I'll cover whatever cancellation fee they charge. And frankly, the dress you picked is also questionable. Tessa found something far more appropriate, more tasteful. It's what you should be wearing at an event like this." I stood there in silence for a moment, the pressure in my chest building like a balloon about to burst. Mason had walked over, sensing the shift in the air, and placed his hand on my shoulder without saying a word. His warmth grounded me enough to finally push back. "Mom, we've already decided. Mason and I agreed on everything. We want the shower to be how we imagined it, not turned into some formal gala." The line went quiet for a beat, and then I heard the sharp intake of breath that always came before one of her signature guilt trips. "You're always like this," she snapped, her voice rising. "So stubborn. You never listen to what's best for you. Tessa's heartbroken, and you flaunting your perfect little pregnancy like this. It's cruel. Do you have any idea how hard this is for her?" I closed my eyes, trying not to lose control. Tessa had been diagnosed with infertility 3 years ago, and ever since I'd announced I was expecting, she'd been distant, cold, and occasionally outright hostile. But my mother treated my pregnancy like a direct attack on my sister's broken dreams. "Mom, I'm not trying to hurt her," I said, my voice barely a whisper now. "But this is a celebration, for me and Mason and our baby." "How selfish can you be?" she hissed. "You think this is just about you? You have no compassion." That was enough. Mason gently took the phone from my hand and brought it to his ear. "Judith, that's enough," he said calmly, though his voice had a firmness I'd only ever heard when he was truly angry. "Nora needs to avoid stress right now. The shower will proceed the way we planned it. If you and Tessa don't want to come, that's your decision." And just like that, he hung up. I hadn't even realized I was trembling until he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I buried my face in his chest. "Why can't she love me?" I whispered, the words slipping out before I even thought them. Mason kissed the top of my head and kept rubbing my back, saying, "It's not about you. It's about her. This isn't your fault." Later that evening, the phone rang again. This time, it was my dad, and his voice carried the same soft regret I'd heard my whole life. "Nora, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about your mother. She's just concerned about you. She didn't mean to upset you." That was his way, always smoothing things over, always trying to soften the blow she delivered like clockwork. But even now, after everything, he couldn't acknowledge that what she did wasn't okay. "It's fine, Dad," I said, tired. "I'm used to it." He promised they'd come to the party, said he'd talk to Mom and Tessa, said they'd come around. But deep down, I knew better. I always knew better. I grew up in that house as the second best daughter. My mother made it clear that I was too emotional, too opinionated, too needy, while Tessa, always perfect in her eyes, got all the love I craved. Tessa used to look at me with this resentment I never understood until years later. When I got a scholarship, she accused me of trying to outshine her. When I got into real estate and started moving up, she said I was obsessed with status. But I didn't want any of that for the show. I just wanted to feel like I was allowed to be happy. Meeting Mason was the only time I ever truly felt seen. He listened. He believed in me. He never made me feel like I had to earn his love with perfection. He made me believe that maybe I wasn't the broken one after all, that I could build something healthy, real, a family, one not twisted up by jealousy and manipulation. When Mason came into the living room later, he sat beside me and asked how the call with my dad had gone. I shrugged and said, "Same as always. He says they'll come, but I'm not counting on anything." Mason took my hand and said, "If they come and try to ruin it, I'll handle it. My job is to protect you and our baby." His words made something in me relax, even if just a little. I didn't know what they were planning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. But I did know that I wasn't going through it alone. And for the first time in my life, I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to keep sacrificing myself just to make someone else feel whole. The morning of the baby shower arrived with that kind of deceptive calm you get before a storm rolls in, and I was trying to hold myself together even though my stomach felt like it had turned to knots. The team at Willowbin Cafe had done a beautiful job, decorating the terrace with soft blue streamers, tiny ivory lights, and clusters of white lilies floating in glass bowls. It wasn't extravagant or loud. It was intimate, warm, and exactly what I had imagined months ago when I first started planning the event. Cora was already there when we arrived, running her usual last-minute checks with the staff and coordinating deliveries like she'd been planning presidential inaugurations her whole life. She caught sight of me near the entrance, immediately rushing over with a huge smile and taking both my hands in hers, squeezing them like she could transfer some of her confidence to me. "You don't need to worry about a thing today," she said with a tone that didn't invite argument. "You just smile, eat cake, and be adored like the goddess you are." I wanted to believe her, and for a brief moment, as I looked around at the beautiful setup and saw some of my coworkers arriving with wide grins and wrapped gifts, I thought maybe this would go okay. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to veer sharply off course. Mason stood beside me, his presence like a shield I didn't have to ask for, and he leaned in to whisper, "If they show up and try anything, I'll shut it down in 5 seconds." I nodded, grateful more than I could say for his calm strength, but part of me still hoped they just wouldn't come. That hope shattered 20 minutes later when I heard the hush fall over the room. I turned, and there they were, my parents and Tessa, stepping through the arched cafe doors like they owned the place, as if this celebration wasn't for a child they'd spent the last several months pretending didn't exist. Judith was in a scarlet dress that clung to her like she thought she was still 30, chin lifted as if this were her party. Tessa, of course, had chosen a skin-tight black number that emphasized every inch of her waist, which was clearly her way of reminding everyone she wasn't the one who'd gained 30 pounds carrying a baby. My dad trailed behind them, shoulders slumped, wearing that same defeated expression I'd seen so many times over the years, like he was just there to keep the peace and hoping to avoid the next explosion. I forced myself to smile, plastering it on like a mask, and walked toward them. "Thanks for coming, Mom, Dad." "Tessa." Judith barely looked at me before her eyes scanned me from head to toe, her mouth twitching with visible disapproval. "You couldn't have picked a looser fit," she muttered, voice just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Your belly's practically shouting for attention in that thing." "It's a maternity dress, Mom," I replied, trying to stay level. "I am pregnant." Before she could say anything else, Cora swept in like a social ninja, handing Judith a glass of champagne and steering her toward the bar. "Welcome. Let me get you a drink. You must be parched after the drive," she said with a smile so dazzling it momentarily disarmed even my mother. Mason gave me a small nod as if to say, "That's round one handled." I took a breath, still rattled, but grateful for the quick save. Despite the tension lurking at the edges of the room, the shower proceeded fairly smoothly at first. My coworkers surrounded me, chatting excitedly about baby names, delivery tips, and cute outfits, and for a while, I felt like I could pretend none of the other noise existed. But Judith never stopped watching me, her gaze like a cold wind on the back of my neck, and Tessa was flitting between my friends with a practiced charm that didn't quite cover the venom underneath. At one point, I caught her telling my colleague Lena, "Nora and I were so close before all this. She's always been the motherly one, not me. I'm more career-focused." I nearly choked on my punch. The reality was the opposite. Tessa had planned her future around kids from the time we were teenagers, while I never even thought seriously about being a mom until I met Mason. But in Tessa's twisted little narrative, she was the selfless sister who had sacrificed everything while I, the villain, paraded around in pastel decorations and baby kicks. Then came the games, which Cora had designed to be light and fun, something to distract everyone and create a few good memories. She handed out cards with parenting advice, and the guests had to guess who wrote which note. Everyone was laughing, especially when someone guessed Mason's advice was from Cora, which he pretended to be deeply insulted by. The levity didn't last. By the time the second round of cards began, Judith was on her third glass of champagne, her voice rising with every sentence, laughter edged with something cruel. Dad gently touched her elbow to calm her down, but she yanked her arm away like he was a stranger. "I have some advice too," she suddenly announced, standing up and wobbling slightly in her heels. "Children are born to punish their parents. Now Nora will finally understand all the hell she put me through." The room froze. A few nervous chuckles popped up, assuming it was some weird joke, but her glare said otherwise. Mason was on his feet instantly, voice calm but stern. "That's enough, Judith. Maybe take a seat, or step outside for some air." Tessa leaned toward our mother, whispered something I couldn't catch, and whatever it was must have been gasoline, because Judith's face twisted in rage as she turned back toward me. "Is that baby even Mason's?" she shouted, loud enough to silence even the background music. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands instinctively cradling my stomach as if I could shield my daughter from the sheer cruelty of that accusation. Mason's entire expression changed, his eyes hardened, and he stepped between us like a wall. "You need to leave. Right now? You're not welcome here anymore." My father stood up too, grabbing my mother's arm, his voice firm for once. "Judith, it's time to go. You've had too much to drink." "Get off me," she barked, shaking him off. "I still have something to say." She was spiraling now, ranting about how I'd always needed attention, how Tessa had suffered in silence while I demanded the spotlight. My friends were looking at each other in confusion, some frozen in place, unsure whether to step in or back away. Cora rushed to my side, whispering, "You've done nothing wrong. Just breathe." But my hands were shaking, my mouth dry, and for the first time in my life, I realized I couldn't let her have the last word. I stood up slowly, placing one hand on the edge of the table to steady myself, and raised my voice. "Mom, please, just for one day, can it be about something other than your anger?" That stopped her for a second, just long enough for Mason to announce loudly, "We're opening the gifts now," trying to salvage the mood before it disintegrated entirely. The moment passed, barely, but I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The tension in the room hung like smoke, thick and suffocating, even though Cora tried to steer everyone back into polite celebration mode with the gift opening. I sat down slowly, hands still trembling as I reached for the first pastel-wrapped box, forcing a smile I could barely hold on to. My mind kept flicking back to my mother's voice, harsh, drunken, echoing in front of people I respected, people who had never seen that side of my family until now. Mason sat beside me, his hand never leaving my back, a subtle pressure meant to anchor me as my world tilted just slightly out of control. One by one, I opened the gifts with careful fingers, trying to keep the mood intact. My coworker Dana had brought an embroidered baby blanket, and when she explained it had been passed down in her family, I felt tears spring to my eyes, not from sadness, but because it reminded me of the kind of warmth I had always wanted in my own family and never truly found. Every time I unwrapped a gift, I said thank you with genuine appreciation, but it was harder with each passing minute to ignore the hovering shadow across the room. Judith stood near the window, still clutching her champagne flute like a lifeline, her shoulders tight and her mouth tight, as if chewing on 100 unsaid insults. Tessa stood next to her with her arms crossed, surveying the room like she was waiting for someone to slip up. She hadn't said much since arriving, aside from her sugary congratulations at the beginning, but her silence was louder than words. It wasn't a supportive silence. It was the kind that sits heavy with resentment, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The rest of the guests were doing their best to pretend everything was fine, smiling awkwardly, glancing between me and my mother with a kind of barely disguised dread, as if they were bracing for another outburst. I wanted so badly for the nightmare to just be over. I was so close to making it through the event without everything unraveling. But Judith wasn't done, not even close. Cora was just starting to wrap up the final round of thank yous when my mother stepped forward again, this time with a wild look in her eyes and a kind of unhinged energy that made everyone stiffen instinctively. Without warning, she reached for the microphone Cora had used for the games and practically tore it from her hands. "I have something to say too," she announced, her voice slurring slightly, but still carrying clear enough to stop every conversation in the room. I tried to stand, but Mason reached out to steady me, whispering, "Don't engage. Let her dig her own grave." But it was too late. Everyone's eyes were on her now, and I could already feel the blood draining from my face. "You all think Nora's this sweet, glowing mother-to-be, but you don't know the real story," Judith said, staggering slightly as she turned to face the crowd. "She's selfish, always has been. From the moment she could walk, she made everything about her, shoved her sister aside like she didn't exist." I heard a few gasps, a few whispered "what the hell" comments. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stand upright, my hands protectively on my belly. I couldn't let her do this, not in front of these people, not again. "Mom, please stop," I said, my voice firm despite the fear crawling up my spine. "This isn't the time, and it's definitely not the place." But she wouldn't even look at me, just kept spiraling, her words gaining speed and venom. "You think you deserve to be celebrated when your sister can't even have children?" Judith hissed. "You flaunt your happiness while she suffers in silence. You don't deserve any of this." The room went dead silent. No one moved. No one even breathed. I felt frozen to the spot, not because of fear, but because for the first time, I realized something deep and ugly. She genuinely believed I didn't deserve this baby. That it should have been Tessa, that I had somehow stolen a life she thought rightfully belonged to someone else. Tessa didn't say anything, didn't move to stop her. She stood there with an unreadable look, but I noticed her lips twitch ever so slightly at the corner, like she was suppressing something. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't shock. It looked disturbingly like satisfaction. That was the moment I knew. I was alone in that part of the family, and I always had been. Mason stepped in front of me then, facing Judith directly, his voice low but cold enough to chill the room. "If you don't stop this now, I'll have you removed. You're not welcome here if you can't show respect." And then it happened, faster than anyone could have predicted. Judith screamed something unintelligible, threw her glass to the ground, and lunged forward. Mason tried to block her, but she shoved him aside with surprising force and grabbed my arm hard enough to make me cry out. "You should never have been born," she spat, eyes wild and bloodshot. The next second was chaos. My heel caught the edge of the terrace tile, my balance vanished, and my center of gravity betrayed me. I stumbled back, tried to regain control, but the edge of the pool was right behind me, and Judith didn't let go. One final shove, and everything vanished in an icy blur as my body hit the water. The shock of cold hit harder than I expected, like knives against my skin. My dress ballooned with water, dragging me down, and I couldn't move fast enough. I couldn't think. My hands flailed, trying to protect my stomach, trying to stay afloat. I heard muffled screams above, people rushing to the edge, someone shouting my name. My lungs burned as I surfaced for a second, choking out, "The baby! Someone help the baby!" before sinking again. Suddenly, arms were around me, strong, desperate, familiar. Mason had jumped in without hesitation, pulling me toward the shallow end while yelling for someone to help. Two of his co-workers leaned over the edge, grabbing my arms and lifting me as gently as they could. I collapsed onto the deck, coughing violently, soaking wet and shaking. My hands clutched my belly like a lifeline. "I don't know if she's okay," I sobbed, unable to stop shaking. "I don't know if she's okay." Mason wrapped me in a towel, his entire body dripping wet, water pouring from his sleeves and hair. "You're okay. We're going to the hospital right now," he said, his voice a mix of fury and panic. His eyes darted across the room, looking for Judith, and found her standing frozen, pale, suddenly silent. Maybe it had finally hit her, what she'd done. But what chilled me more was Tessa, who hadn't moved an inch. Her arms were still crossed, and her face remained unreadable, but I saw it again, that twitch at the corner of her mouth. And that was when my father did something I never expected. He stepped forward, his face ash-gray with fury I'd never seen in my life, and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said clearly. "My daughter's pregnant, and my wife pushed her into a pool. This was no accident." Judith stared at him like he'd just betrayed her. "Stanley, what are you doing?" she gasped, but he didn't answer. He only looked at me, soaking wet and trembling, and said, "This has gone too far." The ambulance ride to the hospital blurred past like a dream I wanted to wake from, except every second was marked by the rhythmic thump of my baby's heartbeat echoing through the monitors they'd strapped to me. Mason sat beside me holding my hand so tightly his knuckles had turned white, but he didn't say much, just kept brushing the wet strands of hair from my face like he couldn't stop needing to reassure himself that I was still there. My clothes were soaked through, clinging to my skin like ice, but the fear inside me burned hot, hotter than any summer sun I'd ever felt. They brought me into the ER and rushed me through an exam, then into an ultrasound room where a technician tried to smile through the tension. I kept my eyes locked on the screen, praying harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. And then, finally, the sound I'd been desperate to hear cut through the silence. The steady, strong pulse of my daughter's tiny heart. The technician nodded with a soft smile. "Heartbeat strong. She's stable. You both are going to be okay." When they let Mason into the room a few minutes later, I don't think I've ever seen relief hit someone that hard. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, knelt beside the bed, and buried his face in my hands. "I thought I lost you," he said, voice hoarse from holding back. "I thought she took you both away from me." I ran my fingers through his damp hair, holding him as tightly as I could, even though my arms still trembled. "She didn't," I whispered. "We're still here. She doesn't get to take anything from us." Outside the room, I could hear murmurs, police voices, low and firm, echoing against the tile walls of the hallway. Cora had come to the hospital too, bringing dry clothes for both Mason and me, and she told us everything that happened after we left. Judith had been handcuffed at the venue, her champagne-glossed fury swapped out for stunned silence. Tessa hadn't defended her. She'd just stood off to the side with her arms folded, answering questions with clipped, emotionless words, insisting she hadn't seen what happened clearly. The officer who later came into our room to take my statement was calm, professional, but not soft. He asked every question slowly and clearly, making sure I understood what was happening. When he asked whether I believed my mother had intentionally shoved me, I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said without flinching. She wasn't confused. She wasn't stumbling. She looked me in the eyes and pushed me. He nodded, then asked about Tessa's behavior. I told him what I remembered, that she whispered something to my mother just moments before things escalated, that she stood back and smiled after I fell. A few other witnesses said the same, he added, scribbling something in his notebook. "We're going to review the full statements and determine if your sister is considered complicit." The door opened just as he was finishing, and to my complete shock, my father stepped inside. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning, his posture hunched, his face drawn and pale, but his eyes were steady. "Can I talk to her alone?" he asked gently, and Mason looked at me for permission before stepping out into the hallway with the officer. I didn't know what to expect, an apology, an excuse, maybe even begging for me to go easy on her. But what I got was something I never imagined I'd hear in 1,000 years. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry for all of it. Not just what she did today, but for every year I let her treat you like this." He sank into the chair beside me, wringing his hands like a man confessing a crime. I was weak. I let her poison the way our home felt. I let Tessa believe she was entitled to everything. And I let you believe you had to shrink yourself to survive. And when I saw you fall, when I saw you hit that water, I realized I might lose you, and it would be my fault too. I didn't say anything for a while. I just looked at him, seeing not the quiet, conflict-avoiding father of my childhood, but a broken man trying desperately to undo damage that had already sunk deep. "She's going to be charged," he said, voice quieter now. "And Tessa's not walking away clean either. The officers said there's enough to at least open an investigation into her involvement." "What are you going to do?" I asked, still unsure what role he wanted to play now that the storm had finally broken. He looked at me with a calm I hadn't seen before. "I've already started divorce proceedings. I called a lawyer tonight. I'm selling the house and moving out of state. I'm done enabling people who destroy others in the name of family." I felt something shift inside me then. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faintest outline of understanding. "Why now?" I asked. "Why finally now?" "Because you lived through something tonight that I could have stopped decades ago. And I won't let the cycle continue into another generation," he said. "I want to be the kind of grandfather your daughter deserves, if you'll let me." I nodded slowly, blinking back tears that felt heavier than any I'd cried in years. "We'll see. I need time. But thank you for finally seeing me." 3 weeks later, we sat across from a lawyer in a quiet office downtown. Mason held my hand as we signed the paperwork for the restraining orders, one for Judith, one for Tessa. My father sat on the other side of the table, shoulders still a little slouched, but his gaze no longer wandered like it used to. He looked like a man with a purpose. Judith was facing a likely suspended sentence and mandatory psychiatric counseling, and she wasn't allowed within 500 feet of me or the baby. Tessa's legal fate was still being decided, but I'd made it clear she was no longer welcome in my life, at least not without a reckoning I didn't believe she was capable of yet. After we left the law office, Mason and I walked to a quiet coffee shop nearby. The air outside was crisp and clean, the kind of early summer breeze that always feels like a reset. He reached across the table, brushing a crumb from the corner of my mouth. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. Like I'm finally standing on my own ground. Not the one they built. Mine. And for the first time, that truth didn't hurt. 10 months later, as sunlight filtered through the garden canopy and the smell of grilled vegetables filled the air, I watched my daughter stumble toward me with those unsteady, glorious first steps that felt more monumental than anything I'd ever accomplished in my 31 years. Elena's soft curls bounced with each determined stride as she toddled across the grass, her arms swinging like tiny wings, eyes wide with pride and curiosity. She reached me breathless and laughing, throwing herself into my arms as if she'd been running marathons, and I scooped her up, pressing a kiss to her flushed cheek. Mason called out from the patio, flipping skewers on the grill, his voice carrying that easy joy that had become the soundtrack of our new life. "Dinner's almost ready. Don't let the star of the show spoil her appetite on peach slices." I turned toward him with a smile, Elena squirming in my arms, pointing at the smoke with wide-eyed fascination. Our new house, tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac in a small Rhode Island suburb, felt like another world compared to everything we'd endured the year before. It wasn't big or flashy, but the energy inside it was different, peaceful, warm, completely ours. After the hospital, we'd made the decision together to move out of the townhouse and start over. The place we'd loved had become haunted by the echoes of that day, by the weight of what happened and what nearly happened. I didn't want to raise our daughter with the scent of old grief in the walls. So we packed up everything, sold what we didn't need, and found a modest home with space to grow and sunlight in every room. The doorbell rang, and I shifted Elena onto my hip as I walked to answer it. When I opened the door, my father stood there with a small wooden box in his hands and a tentative smile on his face. His skin was darker now, tanned from the Arizona sun, and his once hunched shoulders carried a quiet steadiness I hadn't seen in years. "I brought something for Elena," he said, holding out the box. "Took me 2 weeks to carve it." Inside was a delicate horse figurine, polished and detailed, the kind of gift made not with obligation, but with care and time and thought. Elena reached out for it immediately, her fingers wrapping around the smooth curves like she knew it had been made just for her. We moved into the kitchen together, where the smell of lemon zest and garlic bread mingled with the low hum of music playing in the background. I brewed coffee while my dad leaned against the counter, watching Elena play with her new toy on the kitchen floor. After a few minutes, I asked him the question I'd been carrying for weeks but hadn't said aloud yet. "How's she doing?" I meant Judith, of course, though I still struggled to say her name. He took a slow breath and set his mug down carefully before answering. "She finished the court-ordered counseling program last month. She's calmer now, or so they say. But she's not the same woman I married. Maybe she never was." I didn't respond, just nodded and looked out the window, where Mason was waving at Elena through the glass. Then he added, "She asked if she could send a letter. I told her not to." I finally looked at him again. "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than he knew. "What about Tessa?" I asked after a long pause, my voice quieter now. His expression shifted again, shadowed by worry. "She's not working. Lost her job a few months ago. Still blames the world for everything. I try to check in, but she rarely answers." I hesitated, then said, "She actually wrote to me last week. Handwritten, in cursive like she's trying to feel more sincere. Said she wanted to reconnect. Said she was sorry. But between the lines, I could feel it. The manipulation, the subtle digs, the same old blame wearing a new dress." I looked down at my daughter, now spinning in circles with her horse figurine. I didn't respond. I can't afford to reopen that door. Not for her. Not for anyone who ever tried to make me feel small, just for being happy. My dad nodded slowly, not trying to change my mind. "You have a right to protect what you've built," he said. "No one else gets to decide who belongs in your life anymore." A few minutes later, Mason called us outside, and we carried the food to the picnic table under the canopy, where Cora and her fiancé had just arrived, already fawning over Elena like she was royalty. We filled our plates with grilled corn, lemon chicken, and sweet pepper salad, while the laughter of our friends mingled with the warm afternoon breeze. As we ate, Mason raised his glass and said, "To real family, the kind that shows up, stands up, and never makes you question your worth." We all lifted our glasses in return, the sound of the toast rising like a quiet promise above the table. I looked around and realized this was what healing looked like. Not a dramatic showdown or a neat resolution, but the slow, quiet rebuilding of trust in the spaces left behind by pain. After everyone left and the dishes were stacked in the sink, I sat with Elena on the porch swing, her head tucked beneath my chin as she drifted toward sleep. Mason came outside with 2 mugs of tea, setting one beside me before wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, stroking Elena's hair as I replied, "Better than okay. For the first time, I feel like I'm finally living my own story, not the one they wrote for me." He smiled and kissed my temple, the quiet settling over us like a blanket, heavy with peace. And in that stillness, I knew with absolute certainty that love wasn't something I had to earn or beg for. It was something we built, moment by moment, with people who truly saw us, accepted us, and stayed even when things got hard. Whatever came next, I wasn't afraid. Not anymore.